So, hello everyone. My name is Ma'a, and for my section, I'm going to give you a presentation titled Eating Disorders as Survival: Understanding the Relationship Between Trauma and Disordered Eating. So, this presentation is going to include material that could be triggering to some. So, I do want you to make sure that you honor where you are at and that you take care of yourself however you need. Feel free to stop the presentation if you're feeling unwell and to continue afterwards. So the first thing that I'm going to ask you guys to do is to think about where you are at. So I would like you to take a moment and write down, whether it's on a piece of paper or on your phone or whatever, the first thoughts that come to your mind when you hear the words eating disorder. To be clear, there is no right or wrong answers. You will not have to share this with anyone. It's only for you. So I'm going to give you a couple seconds. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to introduce you guys to when talking about eating disorders is going to be the DSM-5 definition. Now, obviously, the DSM is not the end-all be-all, but it is where most clinicians start when they want to talk about eating disorders. So I do think it's worth it to look at what it actually says. So the DSM defines feeding and eating disorders as being characterized by a persistent disturbance of eating or eating-related behavior that results in the altered consumption or absorption of food and that significantly impairs physical health or psychosocial functioning. Diagnostic criteria are provided for pica, rumination disorder, avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and binge eating disorder. So I'm going to go over quickly what each of these are. I won't be spending too much time on it, but I did want to give some attention to what the different diagnoses are because I know that there is often a misconception that eating disorders are only one thing or present in only one way, and I really wanted to give you guys a more broad idea of what it could look like. So the first eating disorder that we're going to talk about is pica, which is when you have these urges to eat some things that are not food. So a lot of people have been introduced to this through the show My Strange Addiction. I don't know if you guys have, but on that show you can see some people having these compulsion to eat things like the fillings of cushions or scent or things like that. Now it's very dangerous, obviously. Eating disorders are actually the mental illness with the highest mortality rate. I'm not quite sure about the specific ratio for pica, but given that it's non-foods, it can have like very dramatic impacts on the body. The next one is rumination disorder. Now, rumination is when you eat the food, but then you have the compulsion to regurgitate it and you either re-chew it, re-swallow it, or you just spit it out. That is not caused by a biological reaction or by another kind of digestive issue. It is a compulsion. It is something that you make yourself do because you feel like you have to. So it's usually supposed to not be in the context of another mental illness, or if it is, it has to be sufficiently serious for it to be receiving its own diagnoses. And it's also not the same thing as the common behavior in anorexia nervosa, which we're going to talk about later, of chewing and spitting, which is when you you chew the food to get the taste, but then you spit it out so that you don't ingest it and therefore ingest the calories or whatever. So the next one is avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. And because it's a mouthful, it's usually referred to as ARFID. And it's usually when you either are not interested in eating, avoid certain foods, or are afraid of certain consequences if you eat certain foods. For example, you could be afraid of choking if you eat carrots, so you will never eat carrots. Or you could have this sensory overload when you eat certain foods, you just can't stand it. And that's a very common thing amongst people who are on the autism spectrum. But once again, if it's going to receive this diagnosis, then it has to be severe enough, which is complicated to define, but that's what the criteria is. The next one that we're going to talk about is perhaps the one that's most known in a way. So it's anorexia nervosa, and it's definitely the one that people mostly think of when they think of eating disorders. And essentially, it's a restriction of energy intake, meaning, food or whatever, compared to what you actually need, and that results in a low body weight. So anorexia nervosa is the only eating disorder that has a weight criteria to it. None of the others do. It can be like one consequence, but it is not a criteria to diagnose the disorders themselves. And there are two subtypes to anorexia nervosa. The first one is the restrictive subtype, which is when you try to lose weight or maintain very low body weight by not eating or through exercise. And the other subtype is the binge purge subtype, which is when you will eat but then make yourself purge, whether that's through abuse of laxative or vomiting, to once again avoid gaining weight. And that brings us to bulimia nervosa. Now, there is a lot of confusion between the binge purge subtype of anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa. So the main difference is that whereas anorexia has this weight component to it, bulimia nervosa does not. So a person doesn't necessarily binge and purge specifically to lose weight. And so as a result, their body weight is actually very likely to remain somewhat stable. And this can lead to often like misdiagnoses. The next one is binge eating disorder. Now that is a more recent diagnosis. It was not there until the last DSM, so the DSM-5. And it's essentially when you have episodes of binging, which is like when you eat a volume of food that another person in the same situation would not, to the point where you're uncomfortably full or you're experiencing pain, and it's a compulsion. So it's not like you're just doing this once. It's a recurrent issue, and there is no compensatory behavior. So you're not purging afterwards. The other one is otherwise specified feeding or eating disorder, which is OSFED, and it applies when you have a majority of symptoms for another one of the diagnoses, but you're not filling out all of them, so then you get this diagnosis. An example is that they give here is if you have low frequencies of binging and purging, but you still have all of the other symptoms of bulimia nervosa. Very often, people who are exhibiting the symptoms of anorexia nervosa but haven't yet reached the significantly low weight, whatever that means, will be given the diagnosis of OSFED, atypical anorexia. And now the other one is unspecified feeding or eating disorder, which is when there is an eating disorder, but it doesn't resemble any of the other ones. So all of these diagnoses are discrete, meaning that you cannot have multiple diagnoses of eating disorder. You may have different ones at different periods of time, but at one given moment, you can't have more than one. Okay, so now that we've gone through all of this information, I'd really like you to take a moment to reflect on what you wrote at the beginning of the presentation, and you might want to ask yourself the following questions. How does it compare to the description given by the DSM? How do you respond to the DSM's criteria? Have you learned something? Do you think you have something to teach? Or you may choose to come up with a completely different reflection. There's no right or wrong answer. This is only for you. I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to do that. So, we're now going to start talking about why people might develop eating disorders. And the very first text that I'm going to be talking about is titled When Dieting Becomes Dangerous, A Guide to Understanding and Treating Anorexia and Bulimia. Now, I know that this one only talks about anorexia and bulimia, and the issue that is very common when you start to research eating disorders is that these are very much the two main ones that people will look at. There is very little data available on any of the other ones, very little research done. I mean, there is some, but it's not a very research area. And especially in the 90s, there was a big increase in the attention given to anorexia and bulimia, but now it's kind of faded. So we don't have as many texts on it. So I chose this specific book because it's a very comprehensive guide and it vulgarizes a lot of the academic research. And it's very often recommended for both sufferers and like families and friends because it provides evidence-based knowledge, but it's easy to understand. So it's easier for them to be able to understand what's going on. However, and it's really important to recognize, it's based on academic research. Now, even the DSM acknowledges that the data that is available is flawed because it is not representative of all sufferers. For example, racial minorities or people of other cultural backgrounds or men are not very well represented because they have a hard time accessing services or care for their situation, whether that's because of money issues or a lack of response from primary care providers. At the end of the day, it's just that they're not represented very often in sampling. So the first quote that I want you guys to look at is this. We know that eating disorders are not about food. The thoughts and behaviors having to do with eating, weight, and body image are symptoms of deeper psychological conflicts and issues. The fact that the principal concern of eating disorders are not food, calories, and weight often confuses families and friends. The focus on food and weight serves to prevent the sufferer from thinking about disturbing underlying issues. And that's taken from the chapter, Why Does Someone Develop an Eating Disorder, in the book. So in this quote, but also in the book as a whole, the author really emphasizes the psychological aspect of eating disorders. They really frame both anorexia and bulimia as coping strategies. And because of that, they really emphasize the need to address not just the actual behaviors, but the roots of the problem, which can be related to trauma, abuse, other anxiety disorders, and actually eating disorders are very prevalent in populations that also suffer from things like depression or anxiety or bipolar disorder and things like that. They also argue in their text, because they reinforce the psychological aspect of the disorder, that there is really a need in treatment for a comprehensive multidisciplinary team. And that would include psychologists, doctors, nutritionists, but also support systems. So friends and family need to be actively involved. So that being said, I'd like you guys to take a moment to digest the information. Does it make sense to you? Does it maybe make you uncomfortable? In what direction does it lead your thoughts and feelings? Once again, there is no wrong answer here. It's just for you. So I'm going to give you a couple of seconds. Okay, so the next book that I'm going to be looking at is called A Hunger So Wide and So Deep, a multiracial view of women's eating problems, and it was written by Becky Thompson. Um, Now, this one is specifically a qualitative research, and it features a series of unstructured interviews with um, lesbians and or racialized women regarding their eating problems. And I specifically want to emphasize the use of the term eating problems because Becky Thompson specifically uses that to resist the medical discourses surrounding eating disorders because she argues that it is inherently the result of discourses that have existed for centuries and that are based on very privileged, male centric, white centric perspective. So she really does want to question why that term is the one that's used the most. So the quote I really liked from her was talking with Latina, African American, and white women, including both heterosexual and lesbian women, reveals that the origins of eating problems have little or nothing to do with vanity or obsession with appearance. In fact, eating problems begin as survival strategies, a sensible act of self-preservation in response to myriad injustices, including racism, sexism, homophobia, classism, the stress of acculturation, and emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. The women interviewed for this book told me stories that starkly expose how eating problems often begin as an orderly and sane response to insane circumstances. And this was in the first chapter of the book titled Making a Way Out of No Way. Now, what is really interesting about that quote is that, yes, we've talked about eating disorders as being coping mechanisms, but here she specifically refers to them as survival strategies about behaviors that allowed the sufferers to get through events so traumatic that had they not had this, they probably would have been completely destroyed. And in doing that, she challenges a series of assumptions about eating problems. And one of the main ones is the characterization of the typical sufferer, which is usually that of a white, heterosexual, cisgender, upper class, thin white girl who suffers from either anorexia or bulimia. And, it's just what these girls do. Instead, she presents a variety of women who are some white, yes, but others Latina or Black, and that come from different places in the world, from various cultural backgrounds, and who are not always talking about the same conception of femininity. And so, as a result, what ends up happening is we get this very diverse view of what is actually causing for each of these women the development of these disorders, which include anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating disorder. Um, and it's really interesting that in that book, she has all of three of these because, as I've mentioned before, usually the only disorders that are very talked about in the literature is anorexia and bulimia. But in her book, she kind of shows that they have a lot more to do with each other because these are, at the end of the day, strategies that allow the participants to survive. And the participants themselves, when they're talking about their own histories, will particularly identify child abuse and neglect, and especially child sexual abuse, as being one of the triggers of their eating problems. And that is something that is very rarely discussed in the literature at large on eating disorders. And I think that it's something that needs to be much more researched because it is very prevalent among sufferers. So, step 4. You're going to take a moment. You're going to breathe and settle. If you need to stretch, stand up, get some water, make yourself comfortable. I know this topic is not easy and its implications can be really triggering or upsetting. So once again, I want you to honor where you are at. Acknowledge your feelings. Suit yourself if you need to. Give yourself permission to take care of your needs. And when you're ready, you can continue. So now that we've established, what eating disorders are, um, why someone might develop one, and how they relate to trauma, the question that's left is really, what can I do? So as an educator, you can try your best to create a body positive environment. You can talk with your students, not just about eating disorders, but mental health in general. You should not assume or demand a diagnosis from someone just because of how you think they look or what you think their behaviors are. You can shut down gossiping on people's weight, size, food consumption. And if you know that someone in your class, in your school, is undergoing care, then you can be kind and understanding. And a very easy way to do that is being lenient in terms of work because recovery takes a lot of energy. And given how high the mortality rates are for eating disorders, it is also a lot more important than school. As a loved one, it's okay to say that you're worried and it's okay to tell someone, I've noticed these things. I'm scared for you. Do you want to talk about it? However, it's not okay to diagnose someone or to decide what they need. In everyday conversation, it's important to try as much as we can to be body positive, to avoid discussions that promote diet culture. If you know that the person has an eating disorder, do not comment on the person's weight, size, or appearance, even if it's meant as a compliment. Telling somebody, oh, you put on some weight, that's so good, is not gonna help them because what ends up happening is their eating disorder voice is gonna say, that means you gain weight, that means you're fat, that means you're bad. So just don't comment on people's appearances. Um, and it's okay to be frustrated, sad, angry, scared, hurt. These are natural emotions when someone you care about is hurting. But it's not okay to make the other person's illness about you. And it's important for you to be able to notice the difference. As an ally, you can promote body positivity or body neutrality. When you do catch yourself engaging in, diet culture talk, fat phobia, or thin ideal talk, acknowledge it, learn from the experience, and then move on and try to do better. Be kind to yourself and your body, honor your needs and your wants. Don't speculate about other people's health, status, diagnoses, or body, and speak up when you can, support when you can, and empower when you can. So, if you do want to do this activity and you are in a good place to do that, I would encourage you to go back to what you've been writing down from the beginning and to ask yourself if there's anything else that you can concretely do to contribute and to help people as either an educator, a loved one, or an ally. So the final thing I'm going to leave you guys with is these two videos. If you guys are interested in learning more about the topic, the first one is titled Things Not to Say to Someone with an Eating Disorder, and it features people who are suffering or have suffered from eating disorders reading common comments that people will make. And it's very lighthearted and funny, but it's also, I think, a very useful way to learn what you shouldn't do. And the other video is made by Katie Morton, and she is a therapist who specializes in the treatment of eating disorders. And she is essentially explaining the difference between an eating disorder and disordered eating. So I will be leaving you with these. Thank you for listening to me, and I hope you guys have a good finals week if you're listening to this during finals. Take care, everyone. Goodbye.